The gunshots came without warning.
It's so loud.
Vivian
I'm
Ashford
scared.
heard them before her brain registered what they were. Sharp cracks that made her bones remember they were fragile. The classroom window exploded inward like someone had thrown a brick wrapped in fury.
Keep close to me.
Glass scattered across the reading corner where fourth graders sat frozen mid-sentence, their eyes suddenly too wide, their mouths stuck in shapes that weren't quite screams yet. In that split second, the moment between the first shot and the second, Vivian's body moved on instinct older than thought. She didn't calculate distances, didn't weigh the consequences, didn't think about her modest apartment, her teacher's salary, her careful life of staying out of trouble. Her feet carried her across the classroom toward the window where Sophia Leclerc sat. That small, 8-year-old girl with eyes that held secrets too heavy for someone who still lost teeth. Vivian's arms wrapped around Sophia as they dropped behind the reading corner. The second shot hit the chalkboard behind where they'd just been standing. Dust and chalk particles hung in the air like toxic snow. Sophia's body was shaking, actually trembling against Vivian's chest like a bird with broken wings. Her breath came out in sounds that weren't quite words. "I've got you," Vivian whispered into the girl's hair. "I've got you. I've got you." More shots. The classroom became a place of sharp noises and screaming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Children ran for the classroom door. Teachers shouted orders that got lost in the chaos. But Vivian didn't move. Her body stayed wrapped around Sophia like armor, like she could somehow absorb any bullet that came looking for this child. She could hear her own heartbeat, fast and loud like something trying to escape her chest. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The sirens came first. Then came the running feet of police officers moving through the hallways. The rapid shots had stopped, replaced by commands being shouted, the sound of boots on linoleum, the crackle of radios. When the paramedics finally reached the classroom, they had to gently pull Vivian away from Sophia. Her arms had locked so tight from gripping the girl that she almost couldn't straighten them. As they loaded Vivian onto the stretcher, because the paramedics had noticed the blood soaking through her cardigan, Sophia reached out. The girl's hand trembled as it touched Vivian's arm. Their eyes locked for a moment, and Sophia whispered something so quiet that Vivian almost missed it. "Thank you for not leaving me like everyone else does." That phrase would replay in Vivian's mind for the rest of her life. Not in a fleeting way, like a song stuck in your head, but like a promise she didn't know she'd made. Like a door opening to a room she couldn't close. Vivian was shot twice, once in the shoulder, once through the ribs. The doctors said she was lucky. The bullet through her ribs missed her lungs and heart by distances measured in millimeters. But luck felt like a strange word for waking up in a hospital bed with tubes in your arms and bandages that made it impossible to move without pain. She'd been in Riverside Elementary for 17 years. She'd taught hundreds of students, most of whom forgot her name within a year of leaving her classroom. But this girl with the too old eyes and the sketches of guns she kept hidden in her desk, this girl saw her. This girl remembered her. 2 weeks passed. Hospital walls turned from beige to something Vivian's pain medication made look almost purple. Visitors came and went. Other teachers brought flowers. Parents sent cards. The principal assured her that her job was waiting whenever she was ready. But Vivian wasn't thinking about her job, or her apartment, or her careful, quiet life. She was thinking about Sophia, and why a second-grade student had spent months drawing pictures of armed men. She was thinking about the way Sophia had whispered those words, like she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to refuse to leave. On the 14th day of her hospital stay, A man walked into her room. He didn't knock, didn't ask if she was awake or in pain or wanted visitors. He simply entered like he owned the room, owned the hospital, owned the space where Vivian breathed. He was tall, maybe mid-50s, with the kind of expensive suit that made everything else in the room look suddenly cheap. His watch cost more than Vivian's car. "Ms. Ashford," he said, pulling a chair close to her bed, "my name is Dominic Leclerc." The name meant nothing to her. But the way he said it, like she should already know, like the entire world should know, made her understand that everything was about to change. Vivian's hand moved toward the call button, but Dominic's expression didn't change. He wasn't threatening her. He was simply sitting there, waiting. "I'm Sophia's father," he continued, "and I need to talk to you about what happens next." What happens next? Vivian's mouth went dry. She was a teacher who'd never committed a crime more serious than exceeding a library book's due date. She had no idea what came next, but the way this man was looking at her, like she'd already made a choice she wasn't aware of making, suggested that her quiet, careful life had just ended. And she still didn't understand why. But the real shock was coming, the real truth. The file he was about to place on her table would unravel everything she thought she knew. The hospital monitors beeped steadily, measuring Vivian's heart rate climbing. She reached for the call button again, but Dominic Leclerc didn't move, didn't react, just watched her like someone studying a painting they were considering purchasing. His hands rested on the chair's armrests, scarred hands, rough hands, hands that looked like they'd seen labor of a different kind than sitting in boardrooms. "Before you press that button," he said quietly, "you should understand what you've already involved yourself in." Vivian's fingers stopped 3 inches from the call button. "I'm a teacher. I protected a student during a school shooting, that's all." Dominic smiled. Not a warm smile, a smile that acknowledged a statement so incomplete it was almost funny. "That's what happened, but not what it means." He leaned forward slightly. "Sophia didn't end up in your classroom by accident, Ms. Ashford. Nothing in my world happens by accident." Vivian's mouth went even drier. She understood suddenly that she'd been sitting in a hospital bed, recovering from gunshot wounds, thinking about a student's drawing of guns, while somewhere someone had orchestrated the entire thing. Her protective instinct, which she'd thought was her own choice, suddenly felt like a puppet response, like she'd been playing a role she didn't audition for. "You're saying the shooting was a message," Dominic finished, "from people who think they can reach me through my daughter. They were wrong about a lot of things." His eyes, which were dark brown and utterly unmoved by the idea that his child could have been killed, stayed locked on Vivian's. "They were wrong about you running. They were wrong about you being weak enough to abandon her. They were wrong about a lot of things." Vivian tried to sit up, but pain shot through her ribs like lightning. She gasped, and Dominic watched her breathe through it without offering help. Teachers were supposed to handle crises. Vivian had always been good at staying calm, at taking charge, at knowing what came next. But she was realizing now that she'd only ever handled crises within a specific world, a world of report cards and parent-teacher conferences and students who needed pencils sharpened. This was a different kind of crisis entirely. "Why are you here?" she managed. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," Dominic said, "I need to know what you're going to do about it." The question hung in the recycled hospital air. The monitors kept beeping. Outside, it was autumn, the kind of autumn that made the trees look like they were on fire. Vivian could see a sliver of it through the window, gold and red leaves, people walking past, People living normal lives where their students' fathers didn't appear in their hospital rooms looking like living proof that terrible things were real. "I'm going to do my job," Vivian said. "I'm going to recover. And I'm going to teach." And Sophia? The question landed like a punch, because they both knew the answer. Sophia wouldn't be safe returning to a normal classroom. Sophia would be watching the doors. Sophia would be remembering gunfire and blood and the moment that everything changed. Sophia would be looking for safety in a world that had just proven it didn't exist. "I'll make sure she's safe," Vivian heard herself say. Dominic nodded slowly, like she'd just given him the answer he'd been waiting for. "Yes, you will. Because you've already proven you're the only person who would." He stood up, and Vivian realized she'd been holding her breath. Dominic walked to the window, looking out at the autumn afternoon. His silhouette against that gold light was oddly peaceful, which was wrong. There was nothing peaceful about this situation. "There's a file on the table beside you," he said without turning around. "Don't open it here. Don't let anyone see you reading it. And don't call the police. The police can't help with what's in that file." Vivian looked to her right. There was indeed a manila folder on the bedside table, the same table where her insurance paperwork and hospital bracelets sat. She'd been too focused on Dominic to notice it arriving. She didn't remember him placing it there, but that was the point. A man like this didn't make things obvious. "What's in the file?" Vivian asked, her voice coming out smaller than she wanted. "The reason your ex-fiancé disappeared 7 years ago," Dominic said, still looking out the window. "And the reason he's about to walk back into your life." He left then, moving as silently as he'd arrived. Vivian sat alone in her hospital bed, her ribs aching, her shoulder throbbing, and her mind trying to process a sentence that couldn't possibly be true. Victor had disappeared 7 years ago after proposing to her at a restaurant she'd thought was romantic but which, she realized now, probably cost more than her monthly rent. He'd been ambitious and charming, and he'd made her feel like she was someone special. Then he was gone. No explanation, no note, just absence. She waited until visiting hours ended and the hallways grew quiet. The night nurse came by to check her vitals, and Vivian didn't mention the file. Once she was alone again, truly alone, she picked it up with hands that shook worse than they had during the actual shooting. The first photograph made her breath stop. It was Victor, but older. A scar ran down the left side of his face that hadn't been there before. He was standing outside a building she didn't recognize, looking at something off camera with an expression that was completely foreign to her. She'd known Victor as a smiling man, optimistic, full of plans. This man looked like someone who'd been remade entirely. The documents underneath the photo were worse. Financial records, bank transfers, names she didn't recognize paired with amounts of money that seemed impossible. And at the bottom of everything, a handwritten note on official-looking paper. Confidential informant number 447. Terminated employment, 2019. Current status, supervised protection. Victor was in witness protection. Victor, who'd asked her to marry him and then vanished, was in witness protection. And Dominic Leclerc, a man who'd just walked into her hospital room like he owned it, was apparently connected to why. Vivian's hands started shaking in a way that had nothing to do with her injuries. She shoved the file back on the table and tried to breathe like the hospital chaplain had taught her to breathe. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. But her heart wouldn't obey, because she knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic, that Victor wasn't staying in the shadows where he'd hidden for 7 years. He was coming. Dominic had made that clear, and when he arrived, Vivian would have to face the man she'd loved and the fact that everything she'd believed about his disappearance had been a lie. Outside her hospital window, The autumn light was fading to purple. Somewhere in the city, a man she'd once wanted to spend her life with was preparing to walk back into her hospital room. And somewhere else, a child who drew pictures of guns was probably wondering if her teacher, the one person who'd chosen to stay, was ever coming back. Everything had shifted on a Tuesday afternoon when gunshots came without warning. But the real rupture, Vivian was beginning to understand, had happened 7 years ago when a man named Victor disappeared. And that disappearance was about to reappear in ways she couldn't control and couldn't predict. The hospital room door opened at 9:47 p.m. Vivian knew the exact time because she'd been watching the clock, watching the hallway, watching for the moment when her past would walk through that door. Her heart had been doing this accelerated thing for the last hour, not panic exactly, but something close enough that the monitor had flagged it. The man who entered looked both completely familiar and entirely like a stranger. It was Victor, yes, the same bone structure, the same way of moving through space like he was comfortable everywhere. But the scar down his left cheek, the gray threaded through his dark hair, the way he held his shoulders like he was waiting for impact, these were new. These were 7 years of absence made visible. "Hey," he said, stopping at the foot of her bed instead of coming closer. His voice was different, too. Harder, less sure of itself. Vivian couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up somewhere between seeing him and processing that he was real. She'd convinced herself he was dead, not actually dead, but emotionally dead, a person who'd moved on to a life so far removed from hers that they might as well be living on different planets. But he was here, and he looked at her like he still knew her, and that was somehow worse than if he'd been a stranger. "I wanted to come to the hospital the day after the shooting," Victor said, still standing at a distance. "Dominic wouldn't let me. He said you needed time, that showing up would complicate things for you." Victor's jaw tightened. "He's usually right about complications." "You work for him," Vivian said. Her voice came out as a statement, not a question. "No, not anymore. But I worked for him for a long time, and then I worked for the government. And now I work for myself while the government pretends to forget I exist." Victor finally moved, pulling the chair close to her bed, the same chair Dominic had sat in, but he sat differently, less in control, more like someone sitting because his legs were tired. "I left you to keep you safe. You understand that, right?" "By disappearing," Vivian said. "By not explaining. By letting me think." She stopped. What did it matter what she'd thought? The thinking belonged to the past. The past was exactly where it should have stayed. "By keeping you out of a world that would have destroyed you." Victor's hands moved like he wanted to touch her but stopped himself. "If I'd told you the truth, if I'd explained where I was going and why, you would have become leveraged. Dominic would have had to ensure your silence. That means either controlling you or eliminating you as a threat. I couldn't." His voice cracked. "I couldn't be responsible for either of those things happening to you." The monitors beeped steadily. A nurse walked past in the hallway, her footsteps fading. Vivian thought about the file, the financial records, the official documents that didn't seem real. She thought about Victor asking her to marry him at a restaurant that had made her feel sophisticated. She thought about the moment he disappeared, how he'd gone for a walk after dinner and simply never come back. "You were laundering money," she said quietly, "before you left." Victor didn't answer for a long moment. "Yes." "And Dominic gave me an opportunity to get out instead of dying inside his organization," Victor said. "He made a deal with federal law enforcement. I testified. I was placed in protection. The man you're looking at is what happened when the man you loved had to die." He touched the scar on his cheek, literally and figuratively. Vivian looked away. Out the window, the city was fully dark now. Streetlights made pools of yellow on empty sidewalks. She could see her own reflection in the glass. A woman with bandages, with an IV in her arm, with a face that looked hollow from pain. She didn't recognize herself either. "Why are you here now?" she asked the window. "Because Sophia asked for you," Victor said. "And because Dominic convinced me that you were the only person who could keep her safe. And because—" He stopped. Started again. "Because I never stopped loving you. Not for 7 seconds of the last 7 years." The statement landed like someone had turned up the volume on the world suddenly. Vivian turned back to look at him, and Victor's eyes were bright, not with tears but with something close. A man who'd been trained not to cry anymore, but who was still trying. "You don't get to say that," Vivian told him. "You don't get to disappear and then say you never stopped loving me." "I know," Victor said. "Believe me, I know. But it's true anyway." A nurse came in to check Vivian's vitals, and Victor stood up, moving back to the corner of the room. The nurse noticed him but didn't comment. Hospital rooms at night often had unexpected visitors, worried family members, guilty friends, people trying to say things they'd been holding on to for too long. After the nurse left, Victor didn't sit back down. "Dominic told you about Sophia's enrollment, about how she ended up in your classroom." It wasn't a question. Vivian nodded anyway. "It was me," Victor said. "I found out about her when I was still in protection. I realized that someone was going to come after Dominic, and Sophia would be exposed. But Dominic needed someone he could trust to watch her, someone safe, someone who wouldn't put her in danger by knowing too much." He paused. "Someone like you." Vivian understood then. The whole trajectory of events, Sophia's vague enrollment, the mysterious visitor asking questions, the black SUV parked outside her house, the threatening flowers, these weren't random, they were orchestrated. She'd been chosen, selected, put in the position of guardian without ever knowing she was auditioning for the role. "I need to ask you something," Victor said, "and I need you to answer honestly." Vivian waited. "Are you going to walk away now that you know the truth? Are you going to take your recovery and your job and your safe life back and pretend this never happened?" The question landed with weight, because part of her wanted to say yes. Part of her wanted to forget about Sophia and Dominic and files hidden in hospital folders. Part of her wanted to go back to being a teacher in a public school who graded papers on Sunday nights and never got involved in anything more complicated than school politics. But that part was getting smaller by the moment. "No," Vivian said. "I'm not going to walk away." Victor's exhale was audible, like he'd been holding his breath since he walked into the room. Okay. Then we need to talk about what comes next. Because Dominic's enemies didn't stop trying to reach him when they failed with the school shooting. They're going to try again. And this time, they'll know exactly who his weak point is. He sat back down, and Vivian realized she was about to hear a story about a world she'd never wanted to know existed. A world of organized crime and federal protection, and decisions that got made in darkness, where ordinary people like teachers and ex-fiancés had to navigate consequences they didn't create. The monitors kept beeping. The city kept being dark outside. And Vivian Ashford, who'd been shot twice for protecting a child she'd known for 3 months, understood that whatever life she'd had before was over. Now she just had to survive the one that was starting. Vivian was discharged from the hospital on the 18th day, which felt both too soon and like she'd been there forever. Her ribs still ached with the kind of pain that made breathing feel optional. The doctors gave her prescriptions and instructions and a folder of follow-up appointments. They didn't ask where she was going. People in hospitals learned not to ask questions that complicated the paperwork. A black car waited at the hospital's front entrance, not trying to hide, not attempting to blend into the parking garage traffic like normal vehicles did. Just black and expensive, and clearly driven by someone who understood that attention wasn't a concern when you had resources. The man who opened the car door was large in the way that suggested gym time and purpose. He didn't introduce himself. I didn't need to. Victor was already in the car, sitting in the back seat like he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. The doors locked with a soft click after Vivian got in, and the car pulled into traffic without hesitation. "Where are we going?" Vivian asked. Her voice sounded hoarse. She'd spent the last week mostly quiet, listening to Victor and Dominic discuss logistics, security, danger levels, the abstract concept of whether keeping her alive was worth the resources it would require. "Somewhere safe," Victor said, "for now." They drove through the city, through neighborhoods Vivian had never been to, through areas that got progressively wealthier as the buildings got taller and the streets got quieter. The car finally pulled into an underground garage beneath a building that looked like the kind of place where people with serious money did serious living. The penthouse was on the 42nd floor. Vivian's ears popped as they went up in an elevator that probably cost more than her childhood home. When the doors opened, she stepped into a space that seemed to exist in a different reality than the one she'd been living in. The floors were marble. Not just marble tiles, but continuous marble that stretched across the entire floor like a frozen lake. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the city spinning away below, all lights and movement and human lives being lived at a distance. Art hung on the walls, actual art, the kind that belonged in museums. A Basquiat maybe, Kehinde Wiley, paintings that cost money in the range of life-changing rather than nice bonus. "Welcome," Dominic said, appearing from an interior hallway like he'd been waiting. He wore casual clothes, dark slacks and a gray shirt, which somehow made him look even more dangerous than the expensive suit. Casual clothes suggested he was so secure in his power that he didn't need to perform it. "I imagine this is very different from where you usually spend your time." Vivian didn't know how to respond. The apartment was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Beautiful because it was objectively stunning. Terrifying because it was clear evidence of the distance between her world and everyone in this room. "Sophia is in the guest room," Dominic continued, walking deeper into the apartment. "She's been waiting for you. The school called. You have a week before you're expected back. I don't think you'll be going back." He said it like a fact, not a question. Vivian wanted to argue. Teaching was her identity, her purpose, but she was beginning to understand that purpose was a luxury people only got to have when their lives weren't complicated by danger. Sophia was asleep when Vivian entered the guest room. The child looked smaller in the enormous bed, curled on her side with one hand tucked under her chin. She was wearing clothes that were clearly expensive, designer children's wear that probably cost more than Vivian's monthly mortgage. But expensive clothes didn't change the fact that Sophia looked haunted. Even in sleep, her face held a tension that shouldn't exist on an 8-year-old's features. Vivian sat on the edge of the bed carefully, trying not to jostle the mattress. Sophia's eyes opened anyway. For a moment, she was completely still. Then her entire body relaxed. "You came," Sophia said. Her voice was rough with sleep and something deeper. Fear, maybe. Or relief that the adult she'd trusted was still available to be trusted. "I promised," Vivian said. Sophia shifted closer, and Vivian settled back against the headboard, letting the girl lean against her shoulder. They sat like that in the dark, two people from completely different worlds who'd been thrown together by violence and connected by something that seemed to bypass the normal rules of how people bonded. "Are the bad people gone?" Sophia asked. Vivian couldn't lie. Not to this child who'd already been lied to by every adult in her life. "No, but we're going to keep you safe." "How?" That was the question, wasn't it? Vivian didn't know. She was a teacher, not a bodyguard. She had no training in protection, no understanding of criminal enterprise or federal law. She had only the absolute certainty that she would not let anything happen to this child. "I don't know yet," Vivian admitted, "but we're going to figure it out." Sophia fell back asleep with her head against Vivian's shoulder. Vivian sat in the dark of that massive bedroom in a penthouse in the sky, watching a child sleep and understanding that her ordinary life was gone. It wasn't coming back. The shooting had changed things irrevocably, but the real change had happened when she'd decided to stay, when she'd chosen this child over safety, when she'd agreed to enter a world that operated by rules she didn't understand. By morning, Vivian's phone had been replaced with a new one, untraceable, Dominic explained. Her apartment had been packed up by professionals. Her job had been quietly handled through the principal, who was told she'd had a family emergency. She was going to take an indefinite leave of absence. Her old life had been sealed up and put away like something being stored in a warehouse. The next week passed in a blur of adjustment. Vivian learned the layout of the penthouse, learned that there was always someone watching, security personnel she could identify if she was paying attention, and plenty she couldn't. Learned that Dominic had staff who anticipated needs before they became apparent. A chef, a housekeeper, people whose jobs it was to keep the machine of his life running smoothly. Victor spent most of his time in a room that Vivian learned was called the office, though she wasn't allowed inside. She could hear phone conversations sometimes, careful conversations that used code words and deliberate vagueness. Victor was still in the game, even if Dominic claimed he'd retired. He was moving through the world in ways that required operational security, ways that required the kind of awareness that had made him change his appearance and abandon his fiancée. On the 7th day, Dominic asked Vivian to meet him in his study. The study was on the opposite side of the penthouse from everything else, darker, more enclosed, the kind of room that existed to keep secrets. Books lined the walls, leather furniture that had been sat in enough times to be comfortable, and paintings, more paintings, but these were different. These were older. These were valuable in a way that suggested generations of careful curation. "I want to discuss the arrangement," Dominic said, gesturing for Vivian to sit. "Your role, your expectations, the terms of your new life." Vivian sat. She was learning that in Dominic's presence, you took opportunities to sit when they were offered. It was a strategy for managing the constant imbalance of power. "You'll remain here," Dominic continued. "You'll care for Sophia. You'll maintain her education. I have tutors who can be arranged. You'll be her mother in every practical sense. Is that clear?" "And if I want to leave?" Vivian asked. Dominic smiled that smile that wasn't warm. "Then you'll understand that you know too much to be allowed to walk away intact. You're too close to my daughter, too close to Victor, too entangled in this world." He paused. "So you'll stay. Not because I'm forcing you, but because you'll realize that the life you had before was a distraction from the life you were always meant to live." The statement should have terrified her. In some ways it did, but underneath the terror was something else. Recognition. Because maybe he was right. Maybe she'd spent 17 years in that classroom waiting for someone to matter to her enough to be worth the risk. "Okay," Vivian said. "I'll stay." Dominic nodded slowly, like she'd just passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. There's one more thing you should know. The people who came after Sophia, they're not done. They're planning something bigger, something that will require a response from me." He stood up, walking to a painting on his wall, something abstract and violent-looking. "When that happens, I'll need to know that you're prepared for what comes next." "What comes next?" Vivian asked. "Blood," Dominic said simply, "and the choice about whether you can live with the person I become when I'm protecting what's mine." Outside, the city sprawled beneath them. Millions of people living in a reality where business was normal, where money was pursued, where violence was something that happened to other people in other neighborhoods. But Vivian wasn't in that reality anymore. She'd stepped outside of it the moment she covered Sophia's body with her own and let the bullets come. Now she was going to find out if she could survive in this new one. 3 months passed in the penthouse like they were happening inside a snow globe. Everything visible but separated from the normal world by something transparent and impenetrable. Vivian fell into rhythms that felt almost normal if you didn't look too closely. Mornings with Sophia. Tutoring sessions with an instructor who appeared daily at 9 a.m. and left at 2. Afternoons where she read to Sophia or sat with the girl while she drew. Evenings where the 3 of them, Vivian, Victor, and Sophia, ate dinner together in the formal dining room while staff moved silently between courses. Victor had become someone she recognized, and someone she didn't at the same time. He smiled at Sophia in ways that suggested he loved her. But Vivian suspected Sophia was the closest thing he had to a child, which meant he was pouring into this relationship everything he couldn't pour into his own fractured history. They moved around each other with the carefulness of people who'd been damaged by the same man, but in different ways. Dominic was rarely home. When he was, he moved through the penthouse like a businessman, which technically he was. Dominic Leclerc Imports, according to the paperwork. He imported specialty goods from Europe and sold them to high-end retailers. The legitimate front was so established that most people probably believed it. Vivian had stopped asking what he actually did. The answer would only make things harder. But there were signs, small things. A phone call was taken in his office where his voice got flat, the way his security detail would tense when he was preparing to leave. The bruise on his knuckle that appeared one morning and was gone by evening, washed away or healed at an accelerated pace. Violence was becoming her normal, which was a terrifying thing to realize about herself. On a Tuesday in December, exactly 2 months after the school shooting, Vivian was reading to Sophia when the building's alarm system activated. Not the fire alarm, something else. Something that made security personnel appear and made Victor's phone buzz constantly. "Stay here," Vivian told Sophia, though she knew the girl would follow her. Children didn't listen to instructions that separated them from safety. Instead, Sophia grabbed her hand and walked with Vivian into the hallway, where they could hear voices, urgent but controlled, coming from Dominic's office. Dominic was on the phone, his voice carrying that flat quality that meant violence was being discussed in abstract terms. "Tell them if they come near my building again, I'll end everyone they've ever loved." A pause. "No, I'm not threatening. I'm explaining the consequences." He saw Vivian and Sophia in the hallway and gestured to them in. When they entered, he was ending the call, his expression unreadable. But his hands were shaking slightly, a tremor that lasted maybe 2 seconds before control reasserted itself. "We have a situation," he said to Vivian. "The family I warned you about, the ones who tried at the school, they're making another move. Not at Sophia, at me. They know I'm vulnerable through the people I care about, so they're going to try a different approach. Direct confrontation." "When?" Vivian asked. "Tonight or tomorrow. My security team is reinforced. The building is in lockdown. You 3 are not leaving this penthouse until the situation is resolved." Dominic's eyes moved to Sophia. I want you to stay in your room. Vivian will be with you the entire time. If anything happens, if you hear anything that frightens you, you go to the panic room behind your closet. Do you understand? Sophia nodded, though her hand was gripping Vivian's tight enough to hurt. Victor appeared in the doorway then. He was wearing clothes that Vivian didn't usually see him in. Dark, tactical gear that made it clear he was about to transition from being Victor, the man who looked sad, to being Victor, the man who'd done things that required federal witness protection. He had a gun in a holster at his waist. It's time, Victor said to Dominic. Then he looked at Vivian. Keep her safe. The words landed between them like a challenge and a prayer. Vivian understood that Victor was about to do something dangerous, that the man she'd loved 7 years ago, the man who disappeared to protect her, was about to reappear in a capacity she couldn't support or help with. He was going to become the person who'd learned in Dominic's organization. He was going to do whatever was necessary. Vivian pulled Sophia closer as Victor left the penthouse. Through the windows, she could see the city below, people living their lives, people who had no idea that violence was being coordinated in a penthouse in the sky. The snow had started to fall, each flake catching light, making the city look like it was being slowly buried under something beautiful and cold. Vivian? Sophia's voice was small. Are they going to try to hurt us again? Vivian looked down at this child who'd drawn pictures of guns, who'd lived her entire life inside layers of protection that never quite protected anything. She thought about the classroom, the moment of decision, the choice to become a shield. Not if I can stop them, Vivian said. It was a promise she had no way of keeping, but it was the only promise that mattered anymore. Because Vivian understood now that love wasn't an emotion. It was a series of choices. It was deciding to stay. It was understanding that some people were worth the risk of everything. It was standing between danger and the people who mattered, knowing full well that you might not survive the collision. Sophia pulled her toward her room, and Vivian followed. The penthouse was quieter now, the kind of quiet that precedes something. Vivian had Sophia change into warm clothes, get into bed. She sat beside her and held her hand while the girl fell asleep with her features screwed up in the way that meant she was dreaming about things that scared her. Outside, the city kept snowing. Inside, Vivian kept vigil. And somewhere in the darkness between those two realities, Victor was preparing to do the thing he'd been trained to do, the thing that had made him disappear from her life 7 years ago. She didn't know if he would come back this time. She didn't know if any of them would survive what was coming. But she knew that standing in a hospital room with gunshot wounds, she'd made a choice. When offered a way out, she'd refused. When given permission to leave, she'd stayed. The choice was made. The line was crossed. And now she was going to find out exactly what kind of person that choice had made her become. The gunfire started at 2:47 a.m. Not tentative, not testing the building's defenses. Full assault, automatic weapons, the kind of violence that announced itself without warning. Vivian's eyes snapped open before her brain caught up to what was happening. Sophia was already awake, sitting upright in bed, her entire body shaking. "The panic room," Vivian said, not asking but commanding in a way she'd never done before. "Now." Sophia moved without hesitation. The two of them crossed the dark bedroom, and Vivian found the closet, felt along the back wall until her fingers found the indentation. The panel slid open. Dominic had thought of everything, had planned for exactly this scenario. Sophia scrambled inside and Vivian followed, sealing the panel behind them. The panic room was small, insulated, designed to be undetectable from outside. It contained water, supplies, a communication device that connected directly to Dominic's security team. Vivian activated it, and a calm male voice answered immediately. "Status?" "We're secure," Vivian said, her own voice steadier than her hands. "Sophia and I are in the panic room." "Stay there. Do not emerge. The building is under siege, but the perimeter is holding. Mr. Leclerc is handling the situation." The line went dead. Vivian looked at Sophia, who was curled into herself like she was trying to take up less space. The sound of gunfire continued from somewhere beyond their sealed walls, distant but real. The building was shaking slightly with each impact. Vivian pulled Sophia close and tried to breathe normally for the child's sake, even as everything inside her was fracturing. Victor was out there, somewhere in that building, in that darkness, facing people who'd come to kill. The man she'd loved, the man who'd disappeared to protect her, was now fighting to keep her alive. The gunfire lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Then, silence. Absolute silence. The kind of silence that happens after violence, when everyone is either dead or waiting to see who survived. Vivian's hand found the communication device. She pressed the button again. No response. She pressed again, and again. Nothing but static. "What's happening?" Sophia whispered. "I don't know," Vivian said, which was the only honest thing she could offer. They waited. In the darkness of the panic room, in the isolation of thick walls designed to protect them from the world, they waited. Vivian held Sophia and tried not to imagine scenarios. She tried not to picture Victor bleeding. She tried not to think about Dominic failing at the one thing he'd promised, that he would keep them safe. Time moved strangely. Minutes felt like hours. Vivian checked the communication device again. Still nothing. She was beginning to understand that being protected sometimes meant being left in darkness, not knowing what was happening beyond the sealed walls. Then the panel opened. It was Dominic. His shirt was torn. Blood was visible on his left arm, soaked into the fabric from shoulder to wrist. His face was calm in the way that only came from absolute certainty that you'd won. Behind him stood Victor, also bloodied, also calm, also moving like someone who'd just crossed a line and found that the other side was where he belonged. "It's clear," Dominic said. "You can come out." Sophia launched herself at her father, wrapping her arms around him. Dominic held her carefully, aware of his injuries, aware of the blood that would transfer to her clothes. He looked at Vivian over the girl's shoulder. "They came through the garage," he said, "planted explosives, disabled our primary security system, but they underestimated our response capacity." That was how Dominic talked about violence. Response capacity. They. Them. Never bodies, never blood, never the reality that somewhere in the building, men who'd been alive that morning were now dead. "Casualties?" Vivian asked. "3 of my men were wounded, none fatally," Dominic said. "All of theirs are accounted for." Meaning they were all dead. Vivian understood that now. She was beginning to understand a lot of things about this world that she'd never wanted to know. Victor moved toward Vivian, and for a moment, she thought he was going to touch her. Instead, he stopped at a distance, respecting the fact that she'd just watched him do something that had changed what it was possible for her to forgive him for. "Is anyone else in the building?" she asked. "No," Victor said. "Dominic sent his staff away before the assault. It was just us, just his security team against theirs. And we won." The statement hung there. They won. As if winning was the most important thing. As if the cost didn't matter as long as the outcome was favorable. "I need to check the rest of the penthouse," Dominic said. "Victor, stay with them. Vivian, take Sophia to her room." Don't let her see anything that's happened elsewhere in the building." He left them there, moving with purpose toward whatever damage had been done. Vivian looked at Victor, really looked at him, and saw that the man who'd disappeared 7 years ago wasn't completely gone, but he changed. They all were. The shooting had started the transformation, but this violence had completed it. They were different people now, people who lived with consequences they couldn't undo. Vivian took Sophia's hand and led her back to the bedroom. She didn't look at the windows, didn't look at the city beyond, didn't acknowledge that whatever life she'd imagined before, the one where she could return to teaching, could return to normal, was gone. That life wasn't coming back. Make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. This story is just beginning, and the decisions that come next will determine everything. What are your thoughts? Drop your comments below. Let me know how you think this will end. And if this story is hitting you emotionally, share it with someone who needs to know that sometimes love means standing between danger and the people we care about. Morning came like it always did, indifferent to violence, indifferent to blood. The sun rose over the city, painting the penthouse in gold light that felt obscene. Vivian had stayed with Sophia through the night, making sure the girl didn't wander into areas where cleanup was still happening. She could hear voices, maintenance people, she assumed, handling whatever mess violence had left behind. By 8 a.m., the penthouse looked normal, restored, the kind of place where crime had never touched anything. Vivian understood that efficiency was its own form of power. Dominic had resources to make violence disappear, or at least to make the evidence of it disappear. Dominic appeared in the kitchen where Vivian was making breakfast for Sophia. He'd changed his clothes. The blood was gone. But his left arm was in a sling, and there was a bandage visible at his neck. "How is she?" he asked, referring to Sophia. "Asleep," Vivian said. "I gave her something to help. A mild sedative. Nothing dangerous." Dominic nodded approvingly. "Good. She doesn't need to process what happened. She's too young." "And what about when she's older?" Vivian asked. "What happens when she understands that violence isn't something that happens to other people? What happens when she realizes that her father solves problems with blood?" Dominic pulled a chair from under the counter and sat down carefully, favoring his right side. "Then she'll understand that the world isn't safe for people like us, and she'll make a choice about whether to accept that or fight it." "There has to be another way," Vivian said, even as she knew it wasn't true. She'd seen the file. She understood what Dominic was involved in. There were no other ways. There were only choices about how to survive the way things actually were. "There isn't," Dominic said quietly. "But I'm beginning to understand why you came to care about my daughter so quickly. You see her the way I see her, as someone worth any price. That's rare. Most people calculate. They weigh risk against reward. You just decided." Victor entered the kitchen then, also changed, also cleaned up. He moved to the counter and started making coffee with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. In other penthouses, maybe. In other lives where he'd been someone other than who he was becoming. "The situation is managed," Victor said. "The people who came after you weren't local. They were out of state, hired specifically, which means whoever hired them thinks you're vulnerable." "Then we'll show them they're wrong," Dominic said. "Set up a meeting. I want whoever's behind this to know that I'm not someone to move against. I want them to understand the cost." "That will require visibility," Victor said. "Put yourself out there, making yourself a target." "I'm always a target," Dominic replied. "The difference is whether I'm a target people are willing to approach. Right now they think they can." Vivian listened to them talk strategy, violence strategy, the kind of conversation that belonged in rooms with locked doors and people who understood what was at stake. She was realizing that staying in this world meant more than just accepting danger. It meant understanding that violence wasn't something that happened to these men. It was something they created, something they controlled, something they used to maintain power. And she was choosing to remain in that world anyway. "I'm moving the meeting to neutral ground," Victor said. "A warehouse. Dominic's territory, but neutral enough that they won't feel completely exposed." "When?" Dominic asked. "Tonight, 9 p.m. The warehouse on 4th and Atlantic." Dominic nodded. "And Vivian?" Victor looked at her. "She stays here, with Sophia, where it's safe." "Safe," Vivian repeated. The word had lost meaning. There was no safety in this world. It was only less dangerous. There was only the kind of protection that came from being locked away from violence. "I need you to understand something," Dominic said, standing up carefully from the chair. "What happened last night, what will happen tonight, this is the price of the choice you made. You chose me. You chose to help raise my daughter. You chose to be part of this world. This is what that choice costs." "And if I'd made a different choice?" Vivian asked. "Then Sophia would be with nannies," Dominic said. "Professional caregivers who exist at a distance from everything I am. She wouldn't have someone who loves her. She'd have staff. But she'd also be alive. That's the trade. Closeness or safety. You can't have both." He left them there, moving toward his office. Victor and Vivian stood in the kitchen, not looking at each other, both understanding that they'd crossed a boundary that couldn't be uncrossed. "Don't try to stop me from going tonight," Victor said finally. "I know what you're thinking. I know you want me to choose you over this, but I can't. This is who I am now. This is what I have to do." "I'm not going to stop you," Vivian said. "I'm going to wait here and hope you come back. And when you do, I'm going to try not to ask you to describe what you did, because I don't want to know, and because knowing won't change anything." Victor finally looked at her. In his eyes was grief for a different version of the future, one where he'd been able to be what she needed, one where he'd managed to stay innocent, one where love had been enough. "I never stopped hoping that somehow we could," he began. "We can," Vivian said. "We are. This is what it looks like. Two people who love each other, navigating a world that doesn't have room for what we want to be." Victor left for the warehouse at 8 p.m., and Vivian didn't watch him go. Instead, she sat with Sophia and read to her, maintaining the fiction that this was a normal evening in a normal penthouse. But they both knew better now. They both understood that violence wasn't something that happened to other people. Violence was something that came looking for people like them, people entangled in the world that Dominic Leclerc controlled. By midnight, Victor still hadn't returned. Vivian had Sophia asleep in her room by 10, and by midnight she was checking the communication device again, trying to reach Victor, trying to get updates that never came. Dominic appeared around 1 a.m., and Vivian knew immediately that something had gone wrong. His expression was the same calm it always was, but his hands were different. Raw. Like he'd personally handled violence instead of delegating. "The meeting went badly," Dominic said. "Victor was hit. Not fatally, but serious enough that he needed surgery." Vivian's blood went cold. "Where is he?" "Hospital. Private facility. Doctors I trust." Dominic paused. "He's going to survive, but he won't be able to function operationally for several weeks." "I need to see him," Vivian said, standing up. "No," Dominic said. "You stay here, with Sophia." Victor's instruction was explicit. "If something happened to him, you were to remain here and protect my daughter. That's what matters now. Not your feelings, not your need to see him. Sophia." Vivian wanted to argue. "I wanted to demand access. wanted to do what a normal woman would do when the man she loved was in a hospital bed. But she wasn't a normal woman anymore. She was someone who'd chosen to enter this world, which meant she had to accept its rules. "How long?" she asked. "For what?" "Until I can see him. Until he comes back." Dominic considered the question. "A week, maybe. Until the wound closes. Until he can move without reopening it." A week. Vivian was going to spend a week in this penthouse, knowing that Victor was somewhere in the city, bleeding from a wound she couldn't tend to, recovering from violence she couldn't prevent. This was the cost of staying. This was what choosing him, choosing Dominic, choosing Sophia meant. She was going to have to get used to this kind of pain, this kind of helplessness, this kind of waiting in darkness, not knowing if the people she cared about would survive the choices they were making. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The next chapter will take everything you think you know about love and loyalty and tear it apart. What happens when the people we love make choices we can't support? When does protection become entrapment? Comment below with your thoughts. This story isn't about romance. It's about survival. It's about the price we pay for the people we choose. 7 days. Vivian counted them like someone marking time in a prison cell. Sophia adapted faster than expected. Children are resilient in ways adults forget how to be. She returned to her tutoring. She drew pictures. She seemed to understand, at some level she couldn't articulate, that Vivian needed the distraction of her routine. But Vivian's mind was elsewhere. Every moment was consumed with trying to imagine what was happening in that private facility. What kind of surgery? How deep the wound was? Whether Victor was going to heal completely or whether he would move through the rest of his life changed by this violence. Dominic appeared every evening with updates that told her nothing. He's stable, healing well. The doctors are satisfied with his progress. Clinical statements that didn't contain any actual information about pain or fear or the emotional devastation of being wounded. On the 8th day, Dominic said Victor was being moved back to the penthouse. Vivian spent the afternoon preparing the guest room, changing sheets, arranging furniture so he'd have clear sight lines to the door. Her hands moved on automatic, while her mind tried to prepare itself for seeing him like that. Wounded, vulnerable, real. When Victor arrived, it was mid-evening. 2 security personnel helped him from the car and up to the penthouse. He was moving carefully, like his entire left side was made of glass. He was pale in a way that suggested he'd lost blood, lost days, lost something essential to who he'd been. Vivian stood in the hallway, not sure if she was supposed to help. Not sure if touching him would hurt him. Not sure if her presence was what he wanted, or if he needed space to exist in his own private recovery. "Hey," he said when he saw her. The word was quiet, hoarse, the sound of someone whose body had gone through trauma. "Hey," she replied. Sophia appeared from her room then, and for a moment everything shifted. She saw Victor and ran toward him, and he had to catch her carefully, angling her away from his left side. His face broke open, the first unguarded expression Vivian had seen on him since the hospital room. Love, pure and unmediated. This was what Victor looked like when he wasn't performing strength, when he could just be someone who cared about a child. "I'm okay," he told Sophia, answering the question the girl hadn't asked yet. "I just need to move slowly for a while." But he wasn't okay. Over the next few days, Vivian understood the real extent of his injury. He was in constant pain. He couldn't raise his left arm past his shoulder. He couldn't sleep properly because lying down aggravated the wound. He moved through the penthouse like a ghost, present physically but absent in the ways that mattered. On the 3rd night of his recovery, Vivian found him in the study, sitting in darkness, looking out at the city. She didn't announce herself, just sat down in the chair beside him and waited. "I was planning to propose to you again," Victor said without preamble. "Before all of this, Dominic and I had discussed it. He thought it would be good for Sophia to see her father and mother choosing each other." Vivian didn't know what to say to that. "I was going to do it at dinner. There's a restaurant, the same one where I proposed the first time. I was going to do it properly. And you were going to say yes, because in the world I was imagining, we actually had a chance at normal." "Victor," Vivian began. "But this," he continued, gesturing at his wounded side, "this is real. This is what normal is for us. Violence and recovery and the constant waiting for the next time someone decides to move against Dominic." He turned to look at her. "So I'm not going to propose. I'm just going to ask, are you willing to keep going? Because I understand if you're not. I understand if you want out. You still have a way out, if you're clever about it." Vivian thought about the time since the school shooting, the speed at which her entire life had been reorganized, the way she'd become someone who could sit in a penthouse and accept violence as a fact of existence. She thought about Sophia, sleeping down the hallway, having healed faster from watching her father be shot than most people ever healed from witnessing violence. "I'm not getting out," Vivian said. "I'm in this, with you, with Sophia, with Dominic and whatever comes next. I'm in it, completely." "Even knowing what that means?" "Even knowing what that means," Vivian confirmed. Victor reached over with his right hand and took her left hand. They sat like that in the darkness, not talking, not moving, just existing in the space between the people they had been and the people they were becoming. "It won't be easy," Victor said finally. "No," Vivian agreed. "It won't be." Outside, the city continued on. Millions of people living lives where violence was something that happened to other people. But in the penthouse, 3 people who'd been broken by circumstance were beginning to understand that maybe being broken together was better than being whole alone. They were creating something new, something that didn't have a name, something that looked like a family if you didn't look too closely at how it was constructed and what it was built on. By the time Victor was healed enough to move independently, something had shifted inside the penthouse. The tension that had existed before, the feeling that Vivian was an outsider being tolerated, had transformed into something else. Acceptance, maybe, or just the recognition that she'd passed the final test. She'd stayed through violence. She'd proven that her commitment wasn't conditional. She was part of this world now, irrevocably and completely. Dominic seemed different too, less guarded around her, more willing to include her in decisions. She was being brought into the inner circle, the space where real power existed, and she understood that crossing that threshold meant she could never return to the ordinary world. She was marked now, changed, transformed by proximity to violence and power, and a man who organized his entire life around protecting the people he loved. Subscribe now if you haven't already. Turn on notifications because what comes next is the moment everything changes. The moment Vivian has to make a final choice about who she is and what she's willing to become. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think she made the right choice? Should she have walked away? Tell me your thoughts and let's continue this journey together. Sophia turned 9 years old in March, and the penthouse transformed into something almost normal. There was a cake. There were gifts. There were moments that looked like a regular family celebrating a child's birthday. But everyone in the space understood that this normalcy was an illusion, a brief suspension of the reality that governed their lives. Vivian had been in the penthouse for 6 months. 6 months of waking up in a world where violence existed alongside domesticity. 6 months of tucking Sophia into bed while understanding that the security team downstairs was armed and watching for threats. 6 months of loving Victor while accepting that he would never be completely safe, would never stop being entangled in the criminal world that Dominic controlled. She'd also stopped trying to teach, not because she was prevented from it, but because her identity had shifted. She wasn't Ms. Ashford anymore, the decorated 4th-grade teacher. She was Vivian, Sophia's de facto mother, Victor's partner, someone deeply embedded in a world that operated by rules she was still learning. Dominic appeared on the evening of Sophia's birthday with an unusual request. He wanted Vivian to meet him in his study, alone. She found him standing at the window, looking down at the city with the expression he got when he was thinking about something that required violence to solve. "I want you to know something," he said without turning around, "about why I brought Sophia into your classroom, about why I orchestrated everything that happened." Vivian had never asked. She'd accepted the story as given, that Sophia's placement was strategic, that her protection was calculated. But standing in the darkness of the study, she understood that Dominic was about to tell her something that would require her to choose whether to stay or leave. "Sophia's mother isn't actually in a federal facility," Dominic continued. "She died. Cancer. When Sophia was 6 years old, and I realized then that I was going to lose her too, not to death, but to her own resentment of me. She was going to grow up and understand what her father did. She was going to hate me for it." He finally turned around. In his expression was the kind of vulnerability Vivian rarely saw from him, the face of a man who'd lost everything and was desperately trying not to lose what remained. "I was searching for someone who could love her unconditionally," Dominic said. "Someone who wasn't connected to my world. Someone who would see her not as a trophy or a liability, but as a child who deserved protection and safety. And then you came into her classroom, and you saw her the way she needed to be seen." "You planted her in my classroom," Vivian said, understanding the full extent of the manipulation. "You arranged all of it, the vague paperwork, the mysterious visitors, the shooting itself." "The shooting I didn't orchestrate," Dominic said. "That was real. That was actually someone moving against me. But I knew it would happen. I'd expected some kind of move in the coming months. And I needed to know how you would respond. I needed to understand what you were made of." Vivian felt like she was falling. Everything she'd believed about her own agency, her own choices, was being recontextualized. She'd thought she was making free decisions, but she'd been playing from the beginning. Every moment of protection, every night of vigilance, every conversation with Sophia, all of it had been part of a calculated strategy to secure a mother figure for a lonely child. "Are you angry?" Dominic asked. "I should be," Vivian said. "I should be furious. I should tell you that you manipulated me and used me and put my life in danger intentionally. But I'm not," Vivian said, "because it worked. Because Sophia is alive and healed, and she has someone who loves her more than anything else in the world. Because I found Victor again. Because I'm here, in this penthouse, and I'm choosing to be here completely. So yes, you manipulated me, but the manipulation created something real." Dominic nodded slowly. "That's why I'm telling you this now, because I need you to understand what you're complicit in, what you've become a part of. I need you to know that there's no going back. You're part of the family now, which means you're part of everything the family does." "I've already accepted that," Vivian said. "I accepted it the moment I decided to stay." "No," Dominic said. "You accepted the version you could rationalize. But there's more coming. There's a transition happening. Someone is moving against my organization. Someone who's been patient, who's been planning, who's going to make one final move to completely destabilize everything I've built. Vivian's stomach tightened. When? Soon, Dominic said. Within the next month. And I need to know that you're prepared, that you understand what's going to be asked of you. And what's that? To protect Sophia at any cost, Dominic said. To take her and run if it comes to that, to never look back, to become someone different than who you are now. The statement hung between them. Vivian understood that Dominic was essentially asking her to be ready to do the one thing she'd been avoiding thinking about since the beginning. She was being asked to be prepared to leave Victor, to abandon the penthouse, to take Sophia and disappear into a world where they'd be fugitives. I'll do what I need to do, Vivian said, to keep Sophia safe. Good, Dominic replied. Then everything I've built, everything I've sacrificed for, will have meaning, because at least the people I love will survive. He walked to his bookshelf and removed a volume that revealed a hidden safe behind it. From the safe, he withdrew documents, passports, money, instructions. He placed them all in a bag and handed it to Vivian. Keep this with you always, he said. If I tell you to run, you run. You don't wait for Victor. You don't wait for me. You take Sophia and you go. Understood? Understood, Vivian said, taking the bag. That night, as she lay in bed next to Victor, who was still recovering, still moving carefully to avoid disturbing his injury, she thought about what Dominic had asked of her. She was being prepared to destroy the life she'd built, to become someone who ran, someone who disappeared, someone who accepted that the people she loved might die and that she would have to survive without them. What happened? Victor asked in the darkness. You've been different since you came back from Dominic's study. Vivian told him. About Sophia's mother, about the manipulation, about the documents in the bag hidden under the bed. He's preparing for the end, Victor said quietly. He thinks he's going to lose. Are you going to stop him? Vivian asked. Are you going to help him fight? Yes, Victor said, and he's going to lose anyway, because he's fighting an enemy that's been planning this for years. Dominic is good at what he does, but he's not good enough to survive what's coming. Then why doesn't he just leave? Vivian asked. Why doesn't he disappear? He has the resources. Because, Victor said, Dominic is a man who's built his entire identity on control, on power, on being the person who determines outcomes. Walking away would be admitting that someone else has more power than he does, and that's something Dominic would rather die than admit. So they lay in darkness, two people who loved each other and a child they both loved, understanding that the world was about to change, that violence was coming, that the penthouse would cease to be a sanctuary and become something else, a battleground, a place where power was tested and measured in blood. And somewhere in the darkness of that understanding, Vivian accepted what she'd been avoiding since the school shooting. She wasn't going to live a normal life. She wasn't going to be a teacher again. She was going to be someone who survived violence, someone who protected the vulnerable, someone who loved people who lived on the edge of darkness. She was going to become someone she didn't recognize, and she was going to do it anyway. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The final chapter is coming. Everything that's been built is about to collapse, and Vivian will have to make the choice that defines the rest of her life. Will she survive? Will Sophia? Will Victor? Drop your theories in the comments. Tell me what you think happens next. And let me know, would you have made the same choices as Vivian? Would you have stayed? Share this story. Tell your friends. Let's see how far this journey travels. The attack came on a night when snow was falling so heavily that the city disappeared behind white curtains. Vivian was reading to Sophia when the building's emergency alarms activated. Not the soft alarm from before, A different one. The kind that meant something had breached the exterior. "Pack a bag," Vivian told Sophia, already moving. "Only what you can carry. Clothes. Nothing else." Sophia didn't ask questions. She'd learned by now that when Vivian said to move, you moved. The girl grabbed a small backpack and started throwing items inside, while Vivian retrieved the bag Dominic had given her. The documents, the money, the instructions written in Dominic's careful hand. Victor appeared in the doorway. He was still moving carefully, still not fully healed, but there was a gun in his hand, and his expression had transformed into something cold and focused. "You need to go," he said. "Now. Not Dominic's original plan. You go now." "Where's Dominic?" Vivian asked. "In the office, handling things," Victor said. "Vivian, listen to me. The man moving against Dominic, his name is Aldridge. He's got resources that Dominic didn't anticipate. The building is compromised. You need to move now." Vivian wanted to argue, wanted to ask Victor to come with them, wanted to refuse to leave without him. But she looked at Sophia, at a child who'd already lost her mother and who couldn't lose her father in a way that meant abandonment by Vivian. So instead of arguing, she took Sophia's hand. "Promise me you'll come to us," Vivian said to Victor. "Promise me you'll fight hard and then come to us." "I promise," Victor said. And she believed him because she needed to believe him, and because lies were sometimes the most honest thing two people could give each other. Vivian took Sophia through the back corridors of the penthouse, passages Dominic had made sure she knew about. They moved through darkness toward a service elevator that would take them to the parking garage. Behind them, the sounds of violence were intensifying. Gunfire, shouts, the kinds of noises that meant a war was being fought in the spaces she'd inhabited. The garage was surprisingly empty. The car, prepared, ready, was exactly where Dominic had said it would be. Keys on the driver's seat, documents already in the glove compartment. This was what having resources meant, having contingencies, having places to run to even when the world was burning. Vivian got Sophia into the passenger seat and pulled away from the garage just as she heard a massive explosion somewhere above. The penthouse, the place where she'd lived for 6 months, the place where she'd loved Victor, the place where she'd tried to become someone stable in an unstable world. It was gone, burning, collapsing in ways that suggested Dominic had rigged explosives as a last resort, something to destroy what remained if he couldn't protect it. Vivian drove. Sophia cried silently beside her, tears streaming down her face without sound. And Vivian made a choice, the choice she'd been making all along, just without admitting it to herself. She was going to run. She was going.